It's my great pleasure as Master of Birkbeck to welcome you to this first Ronald Tress Memorial Lecture. And of course I have spent a lot of my time here welcoming people to all sorts of lectures, but this is the first time that I've had the privilege of welcoming people to a lecture in memory of one of my very esteemed predecessors, who of course was the Master of Birkbeck from 1968 to 1977, following distinguished earlier career as an economist in the war and other university posts, and of course went on to become director of the Leverhulme Trust when he left Birkbeck. And his association with Birkbeck did not end when he left as master. He continued as a fellow of Birkbeck until his passing in 2006, and in fact endowed a prize for young academics, which we award annually. And if you search Ronald Tress on the online, you find numerous references, of course, to his distinguished career, but you also find references to many academics at Birkbeck and elsewhere who have won the Ronald Tress Prize during their time here and continue clearly to regard it as a prestigious achievement which they should mention on their websites, and clearly it's a mark of distinction for younger colleagues that they use to further their careers. So that's something we have as a lasting legacy which we continue to present. And of course, when I first became Master of Birkbeck a few years ago, I got a lovely letter from Ronald Tress, who has, I'm sure some of you will know, had a tremendous writing style, apologising that he was too infirm to come into the college, but inviting me to visit him. And so I went to Twickenham, where he lived in a self-contained basement flat in the house of his son, Tom, and I'm delighted Tom is here together with his sister and other members of the family. I experienced the delightful sandwiches that Tom's wife prepared for us on that occasion, and I experienced something of what made Ronald Tress such an outstanding person and such a great Master of Birkbeck. He said to me, you know, there's always an issue of how you deal with academics in the academic board when you're the master. And he says, sometimes everybody agrees with you, so that's very good. Sometimes, he says, there are a couple of people who agree with you, so when you sum up, you just say, I thought Professor so-and-so made a very good point, and we'll move forward from that. But sometimes, he says, the problem is when nobody agrees with you. What do you do then? And he said, well, my advice to you, David, is that most of the time you should say, we are an academic community and I bow to the will of the majority. And occasionally you bang the table and you say, I am the master and we are doing this. Now, I haven't had to do that because, as I explained to Ronald, I have one other trick up my sleeve, which is to say, you can do this, but we'll be merged with UCL in 5 years' time if you do. And of course, that's a tremendous threat here, as many of you will know. And the reason that Birkbeck survives and that Birkbeck flourishes as an independent institution dedicated to part-time students with the highest research rankings that we've ever had is due to the legacy that we have from Ronald Tress and from other tremendous leaders of the college, and also to the tremendous staff we have. And I continue to be amazed by how many of our staff have remained loyal to us over considerable periods, despite the fact that their tremendous research achievements must have resulted in many tempting offers. And of course, we have a prime example tonight in the first Ronald Tress lecturer, in Professor Ron Smith. Ron was actually appointed and interviewed by Ronald Tress, so part of the legacy of being able to spot a good young lecturer. And of course, he has risen through the ranks in a distinguished career, moving up to becoming professor, I think in 1985, taking roles throughout the department, the faculty, and the college as Pro-Vice Master at one time, and really being a sound bastion of common sense. And I always felt, as I looked out of my window and saw Ron having his fag outside on the portico, that Birkbeck was continuing and that he was there as a steadying influence. Well, he's still here, but he's given up the cigarettes, and it's now 15 weeks. So this... And this lecture is going to be even better than his former students remember, because he's not craving to run outside for a nicotine fix as soon as the lecture is over. So not just because of that, but because of his enormous research standing, because of his loyalty to Birkbeck, and because he is a thoroughly nice person, I'd like to invite Ron Smith to give the first Ronald Tress Memorial Lecture on the subject that you've got up there, Military Economics, Defence Choices for the UK. Ron.
Thank you. As the Master said, I was interviewed by Ronnie Tress, and in those days there wasn't sort of the same sort of personnel things, so everything was much more casual than human relations would allow us to do now. And Ronnie Tress bought a building in Gressy Street, which people will remember with great fondness, or maybe not. And when it was bought, it was a very sleazy area. It was said, you know, it would have been Soho if Soho had the strength to crawl across Oxford Street. Life was very different in those days. And I remember when the thin end of the wedge started and they banned smoking during lectures. And there was an outcry by the students because the students had managed to catch up on their note-taking as I got my cigarettes out, stuck the things in, and so that the problem of speeding up was a sort of issue. Anyway, let me talk about the issues of defence choices for the UK. Now, there's a lot of economic issues in defence. Classic question of allocation of scarce resources between competing ends. The choices, what are the means, what are the ends that you're using? What are the incentives to make those choices? And there are a whole lot of classical principal agent problems in defence. And I quite often lecture to the military, and it's a very different sort of lecture to here. You know, it would have been the dean would have come in and said, "Attention," and I would have marched down while you were all standing sharply to attention with the master behind me, hoping that I didn't trip up as I got to the end. And I'm always very nicely introduced by the military, who say that I'm one of the leading academic economists, defence economists in the country. And that is certainly true. There are 3 of us. Now, despite there being this large economic element, defence economics hasn't really caught on. And what I'm going to do is review UK defence policy, examine the policy process, and I'm going to compare the UK and France. They're very similar in a lot of ways, but very different in other ways. And I'm going to assess the prospects for an affordable and sustainable defence policy. And don't hold your breath. No prospects for an affordable and sustainable defence policy. The story of... this is a great area because I can recycle lecture notes. I have now been giving pretty much the same lecture for almost 40 years. And it's the story of British defence policy since 1945. You get these recurrent imbalances between budgets, the amount the government decides, the capabilities, what they can do, and the commitments. And the programme, as it's called, gets completely out of joint, and every now and again they have a defence review and cancel some of the capabilities. And these defence reviews are usually during economic crises, not always. And this pattern of alternating imbalances and reappraisals is extremely wasteful. But it's been going on for a long time. And one of the consequences is the projects are just postponed. They just push them into the future. And this is called, in the military terminology, a bow wave. It's that little bit of extra expenditure which you can't afford now, but you hope will be able to afford. And these long-term projects, aircraft carriers, JSF, all those big things, they just absorb a large part of the budget. And that leaves relatively little money for actually very valuable smaller projects like body armour or armoured vehicles that are resistant to improvised explosive devices, and they get squeezed out by the big projects. And these smaller projects then have to be acquired very, very rapidly as urgent operational requirements, UORs, out of the spending for operations when you suddenly discover that you actually do need these things. Now, one of the things that's been striking over the last year or two is a widespread recognition of Ministry of Defence failures. There's just a whole lot of documents, starting the report by Bernard Gray, commissioned by under the Labour government, and a whole range of these reports, and I'll quote from some of them. Now, it's quite common for the National Audit Office to be nasty about the Ministry of Defence, academics like me to be nasty about the Ministry of Defence, parliamentary select committees to be nasty about the Ministry of Defence, but these are all insiders being nasty about the Ministry of Defence, and that is striking. And it's particularly the case that Liam Fox, he had a very easy thing. He could just blame it all on Labour. There was a lot of blame there, and that was entitled, but no, there was a recognition that there actually was a systemic failure. Now, within the Ministry of Defence, number one enemy is the Treasury, and if you ever talk to anybody in the Ministry of Defence, they'll tell you all the things that's wrong with the Treasury. And it's the Treasury that essentially controls them. And they take it seriously. During the Cold War, had there been a nuclear attack, the 125 top decision makers would have been moved to special bunkers in the West Country. Ministry of Defence was in charge of that list. Nobody from the Treasury was included on it. Clearly that was one function which they could do without afterwards. And you don't often hear what the Treasury thinks about the Ministry of Defence. But this is Bernard Gray who did this report. He went and talked to the Treasury, and he reported to the House of Commons Defence Committee that the Treasury thought there were three key Ministry of Defence weaknesses. Programme substantially out of balance. There was just no control of the programme. Lack of clarity and leadership in Ministry of Defence main building, particularly at the head of the organisation, and lack of accountability and responsibility. Insufficient skills inside Defence Equipment and Support, DE&S, which is the main procurement organisation, to discharge the job. And there's lots more of those. These are insiders. Lord Levine, who was head of procurement, one of the great and the good, in his report on defence reform, talked about Ministry of Defence's inability to take tough, timely decisions in the defence interests, particularly those necessary to ensure financial control and an affordable defence programme. That finance and affordability are not regarded as sufficiently important, insufficient skills and lack of financial rigour throughout the organisation. Somebody who was a co-author of me and now is Lord Curry of Marylebone conducted a report on single source contracting, which is where non-competitive, where there's only a single producer, and he talked about the conspiracy of optimism, deliberate underestimation of project costs and timescales, and overestimation of performance capability by both Ministry of Defence and industry to support the initiation and continuation of projects in the knowledge that they are unlikely to be terminated once reality becomes evident. Now, I think it's, in this area, it's typically referred to as the conspiracy of optimism. And I think that's not quite right. Conspiracy sort of suggests that people get together and plot. They don't need to plot. It's just so obviously a good thing to underestimate costs that you don't need to coordinate at all. Now, the Ministry of Defence has promised in the recent white paper to publish a sustainable 10-year budget for the equipment plan. And Secretary of State Philip Hammond describes himself as a natural budget balancer. He describes himself as a numbers man. He's got a range of reforms underway which are supposed to achieve this, particularly implementing the Levine report on Defence Ministry report. But given the history, given how previous reforms have failed, and given the incentives of all the actors, I don't think it's going to work. And regularly, as I've said, over the 40 years I've been doing it, Ministry of Defence doesn't have many other academic economists to invite, so they have to invite me on occasion. And every time I say, I'm sceptical, and they say, but this time is different. Anybody who knows the classic book on 8 Centuries of Financial Folly about financial crises by Reinhardt and Rogoff will know it's called This Time is Different. It's what you say before the run-up to every financial crisis. Okay, now one of the things about defence reform is analysis is easy. It's very straightforward to say what the problems are. What is difficult is implementing the solutions. Okay. Every review of procurement failures, Solly Zuckerman's in the early 60s, Downey's in the late 60s, learning through experience, every one of them has the same recommendation. You spend about 10-15% of the development budget up front to de-risk the project. Do technology demonstrators, some systems integration, find out. It's never done. Why? Because nobody has any interest in finding out problems which will stop this equipment getting into the system. Industry want it, the military want it, the civil servants want it, and the money seems wasted if there's no problems, so they just don't do that, despite the fact that it's happening. And so what happens is each of these groups in the defence community, the 3 services, the politicians, the scientists, civil servants, industry, they all face a set of incentives which lead to actions which are rational from their own point of view, but profoundly dysfunctional from the point of view of the Ministry of Defence as a whole. And these incentives generate 3 biases which are typical. Firstly is the optimism bias, this conspiracy of optimism, underestimate time, cost, technical difficulties in meeting performance targets. And then there's a certainty bias. People want things to be certain. And this is an area where you can't have any certainty at all. But ministers, civil servants like to come and say, this is what's going to happen, this is why this is the optimal solution. And that causes you to then have what's a relatively taut financial plan with no reserves, no contingency allowances, etc. So you can't respond to the unpredicted, the really unpredicted things which happen all the time, and the predictable unpredicted, the cost overruns, which you should be able to do. The third thing, which is quite dangerous, is a can-do bias. The politicians want to say, yes, we can meet these commitments. We are going to defend the Falklands. The military have a can-do bias. If the politicians ask them, go recapture the Falklands, the military's natural inclination is to say, oh yes, we can do it. And then they start looking at each other. In the military joint staff college, around major level, you go and do a year if you're going to get promoted, and you can also get a master's degree from King's in defence studies from that. And so because it's a master's degree, you have external examiners and all the sorts of things that you have with degrees. And I was the external examiner for a while, and one of the essays they have to write is, why did Argentina lose and Britain win in the Falklands? And it was obvious, they all would write down these things about how the British were so competent, etc. Things. The directing staff, who were older and who'd been there, they would just shake their heads and say, God, it was so close run. We were so lucky to get away with that. Any number of things which could have gone wrong, and we wouldn't have been able to do anything. In particular, the main thing which the Argentinians got wrong is not waiting 6 months. The Knott Review of 1981 was scrapping all that capability which went with the task force. Had they waited till it was scrapped, it wouldn't have gone. And there's a list of things which just made it very close. So most of the people I've talked to who are involved say it really was incredibly close run. Now that's big risks. Firstly, in giving commitments, just hoping that nobody will call you up on those commitments. And then secondly, if somebody calls you on those commitments, sending the troops out and that bias. So I think these biases I'll come back to later on as we go through. Since this is a business school, I've got to have a value chain. So the way I think of it is budgets go in on the left-hand side there. They produce forces, tanks, aircraft, things like that. That produces military capability, the ability to do things, in particular, the ability to win in combat. That then is used to meet your commitments, and it contributes somehow or other to strategy in that sort of way. So we're looking at that sort of linkage, and the problem is all those links are very, very uncertain. You can spend vast amounts of money, like on Nimrod aircraft, get no forces because it gets cancelled before it goes into service. And in fact, one of the nice sort of examples of conversion, there was an exhibition in Tate Britain, which was Jaguar and Harrier, and there was a Harrier jet hanging from the ceiling and a Jaguar jet on its back lying on the floor, and these had been recommissioned and handled by an artist to make those things. So you get this optimism bias because you think you can get more forces for your budget than you can. You get this certainty bias. You think you've got the right forces to provide the capabilities you need, and you get this can-do bias when you're called up to meet those commitments which you don't really have the capability to handle. Now, in principle, for economic problems like the one I set out in that value chain, what you should do is think forward and reason back. You think, what is the threat to our commitments? What are the capabilities, military or otherwise, that we need to meet them? What are the forces to provide those capabilities? What's the budget need to provide those forces? And if you've got it right, the marginal security benefits will equal the opportunity costs of your defence budget. So if in that sort of framework, sort of rational economic framework, you ask, what will be the UK role in the world, and what is its associated vital interests? What are the most likely threats to those interests? And what are going to be the most effective military responses to those threats? And what's the answer? We have no idea. They're just not answerable questions. Every previous defence review was overtaken by events that have not been predicted, and so has the Strategic Defence and Security Review of 2010. Classic example was Nott's Defence Review of 81, followed by the Falklands, but the 2010, nobody, when they were writing that review in 2010, thought we'd be bombing Libya in no time at all. In particular, bombing Libya without aircraft carriers. And so you have to muddle through. Optimization doesn't work very well when you can't predict in those structures. So now, the sort of basic question you ask an economist is how much? And the question is, how much do we spend on defence? Then you start getting into the economists, on the one hand, on the other, what do we actually include in the budget or not? So now I'm going to compare Britain and France. France has a whole set of paramilitaries, the gendarmerie, included in their budgets. We don't have anything like the gendarmerie to include. Comparing with the US, a major part of the US defence budget is the Veterans Administration, providing health care for veterans because there's no National Health Service. So there's big differences of things. Now, in the 20th century, public expenditure was measured in cash. But cash is so last century that defence budgets aren't measured in cash anymore. They're measured in something called RABs, Resource Accounting and Budgeting. And this tries to make the Ministry of Defence like a more commercial activity, and so there's a proper set of accounts with balance sheets and all the rest, and depreciation and capital consumption, etc. Not a big deal for most ministries. It is a big deal for the Ministry of Defence because it's got 100 billion in assets. Large chunks of Salisbury Plain, large number of ships, planes, etc. So how you do that accounting is a real issue. And if you get to 1-star or 2-star level, which is sort of brigadier, major general, and then get responsible for a big budget, they send you on a defense strategic finance course where you have a week to learn budgeting and accounting. And you would also get me to introduce you to the economic sorts of issues. And you can imagine that most of these military people, the last thing they joined the army to do was to do accounts. And the other thing struck, it said you know you're old when the policemen start looking very young. You know you're very, very old when the major generals start looking very young. So that the treatment of the assets is, because there's all these assets, the planes, the Chelsea barracks, which was sold off, etc. How do you value these things? It said that economists are people who are good with numbers but not creative enough to be accountants. And the accountants who valued a large number of these Ministry of Defence assets certainly had a range, because a lot of them are very, very old. How do you measure defence inflation? There's a range of problems. In fact, there was an Atkinson report which said we need to improve the national accounts, and in particular we needed to get better measures of the output of the government. They had a go at education, had a go at health. They just gave up completely with defence. Measuring what the output of defence is a real problem. So we normally think of it, the defence budget, as a share of GDP, and look at how that moves through time. And this is a picture starting in 1830s of the defence budget as a share of GDP. They didn't measure GDP in the 1830s, but economic historians have gone back and done it. And I've chopped it off at 15%. You can see that little peak there, that's the Crimean War and the Indian Mutiny, or the First War of Independence, depending on how you look at it. The Boer War, First World War goes up to 50%, Second World War goes up to 50%, blip there for Korean War, blip there in the 80s, which was sometimes called the Second Cold War after the invasion of Afghanistan, coming back down to around its long-term peacetime average of around 2–2.5%. So that's the long-term perspective on what would happen. And so Britain acquired an empire spending around 2–2.5% of GDP on defence. That's partly because navies are very cheap ways of projecting force, and the colonies, once acquired, paid for most of their own, quote, defence in that circumstance. It's interesting, the comparison with France. They're both ex-colonial nuclear powers on the United Nations, 5 members of the Permanent Security Council, and they both value what the French call their grandeur, and we call our seat at the top table. Relative to other European countries, they both use force a lot. Both, members of the British Armed Forces have lost their lives in active service pretty much every year since 1945, 46. I think 1968 was the 1 year when they did it. France is very similar. Compared to the other European countries, we do use force a lot. Very similar defence budgets and shares of GDP, I'll show you in a moment, and that's much higher than other European countries. Both had real difficulties financing their strategic aspirations. Both let their arms exports drive foreign policy. Us with the Al-Yamama, we never disagree with Saudi Arabia on anything, even when it involves cancelling corruption trials, because that's such a large contract. But they make very different choices in other respects. So let me just show you the shares. They look very, very similar. Shares in GDP. They're rather different reasons. The dotted one is the UK. That peak there was the Korean War for the UK. The peak was the Indochina wars for France. There's another peak for Algeria there. Both came down. During the middle of the Cold War, the British spent more. but they're back down almost exactly the same. Very, very similar. If you do the statistics, it seems that France is following the UK, but it's not clear cut. Big differences. Probably the main strategic event for both of them was their joint invasion of Suez in 1956. In one of the few cases where economic sanctions are effective, after Britain, France, with the conjunction of Israel, invaded Suez, the US said, get out or we'll destroy your currencies. And they got out very quickly. Britain saw it. US was a superpower, couldn't be relied to support UK interests, so you had to keep as close to the US as possible. France saw it. US was a superpower, couldn't be relied to support French interests, so you keep as far from the US as possible. And very different things. And so as a result, Britain got its nuclear capability very cheaply from the US. France had to develop it very expensively. France went for a much more labour-intensive defence structure, had conscription up to the 2000s. Britain abolished conscription in the 1950s. Britain, and this again fits their industrial policy, French dirigisme meant it was state ownership, and still remains a large part of the French arms industry is owned by the state. And in fact, you would think that having a lot of state ownership would give the state power, for instance, in restructuring the industry, but in fact, the French state has really been subordinate to the industry, particularly to Dassault, rather than the other way around. Now, because they're very similar, they can't agree who's going to be in charge, and that makes, well, each of them knows who should be in charge. They can say it's very hard for them to collaborate. So they're easier collaborating well. There was treaties signed in December 2010, and there's sharing aircraft carriers, nuclear research, etc. But we've fallen out since then, and nothing much seems to have happened. One thing which is striking is France doesn't have these waves of agonizing reappraisal. It has a much longer term pattern. So it doesn't have the pattern of defence reviews that we do. Okay. So what I've done here is plotted the UK growth rate and put the defence reviews on it. Sandys, where conscription was abolished, Healey's first defence review, when reduced east, or actually withdraw from east of Suez. Healey's second defence review, when he was Chancellor, more withdrawing from east of Suez. Knott's review in 1981, just before the Falklands. This one's called Options for Change in the early 1990s. Strategic Defence Review, Strategic Defence and Security Review that we've just had. What you'll notice about all of them, except for SDSR, is they're down where the bottom of these things. There's economic crises that provokes them. The French have not had that same sort of structure. The system becomes unsustainable, but it's the economic crisis that makes it change. Okay. Now, again, when I talk to the Major Generals, I show them this picture, and this is the Bank of England fan chart, and it gives you the green area, gives you the 90% confidence interval. And they look at that and they say, well, you're 90% certain that growth will be between 0 and 6%. What use is that? Now, in a sense, I think this is probably one of the most valuable things that the bank has done, in the sense of getting people to say, we have to recognize that uncertainty. There's a story of an economist who was asked by the US President, Lyndon Johnson, to ask what was the effect on unemployment of a particular change that was being proposed. And the economist, as economists do, give him a range between this and that. And LBJ said, ranges are for cattle, give me a number. And that's the pressure. Now, this is the certainty bias. People want to say, it might be between 0 and 6 isn't good enough, but that's all we can say. And in fact, if anything, that's a bit too conservative. Here's the August 2008 band chart. And the range there, actual, way, way down. You can't forecast these things. It's a real problem in terms of doing it, and recognition of the uncertainties and building in some sort of structure to deal with uncertainty is even more important in the military sphere than it is within the economic sphere. Okay. And the area where the economics is crucial is weapons acquisition. This is really hard decisions because you're trading off time, cost, performance, a lot of uncertainty, and because of this uncertainty, there's no ideal contractual system. So supposing you have fixed price competitive, you run a tender, and the lowest price wins the tender. Who wins the bid? It's the firm that's too stupid to know all the technical problems and underbids. It's known in economics as the winner's curse. Now, if it's just that, and it's a transfer from the firm to the MOD, that's no problem. But these firms are going to go bankrupt because these contracts are really large. Rolls-Royce went bankrupt on a fixed price civil contract, not a military contract on RB211. So there's a real issue. If you have cost plus, it's very flexible, but there's no incentive to minimize costs. And the target cost incentive fee, which is the standard framework, really doesn't provide that much incentive to cut costs. Now, the French do it different. The Délégation Générale de l'Armement, DGA, and it's staffed primarily by engineers. They work within the system, they come from the Polytechnique, they move between the arms firms and the DGA, so they're specialists, and David Curry says they're independent from any one service. They don't let the military have too much influence over what weapons are bought. A separate report by Capstein and Nugent says the French system is characterised by hard budget constraints. I'll tell you what that means in a moment. The technical capacity of the DGA and the iterative relationship with the small number of suppliers, these big French firms, and giving a lot of autonomy to project managers. And remember that the quotes that I started with were the lack of skill in MOD. The French have the skill. Now, whether you'd be able to do this in the UK or not is unclear because working for the state has a much higher prestige in France than it does in the UK. Could we copy them? It's unlikely. Firstly, it would require, Curry said, it would require culture change. DGA hard budget constraints mean if something goes over budget, you cancel it, you stop it. MOD wouldn't like that. Tight contractual commitments means at the beginning you say, this is what we want, and the industry delivers it. MOD wouldn't like that either. They keep changing the requirements. Sometimes that's justified. You find new threats, etc. Sometimes it's a new project manager who just wants to show that he's made a contribution to this sort of thing. And it just may not be credible to say that you'll cancel if it goes over. And in the US, they're supposed to have tight budget constraints. US programs should be cancelled if 25% overrun occurs. Notice that's quite a big overrun, but not big by defence standards. But they rarely are, because the Secretary of Defence can override this just by submitting a report saying why the programme is essential. So it's not at all clear that the French structure would be... okay. So, in principle, there are solutions. This hard budget constraint really cancel projects to penalise that optimism bias so that people know that if they underestimate too much, the project would be cancelled and they'll get the blame. Getting that accountability through would do it. I can't see that happening. Now, you'd improve the financial and contractual skills. Now, given the financial skills are paid a lot more in the city, you're not going to be able to pay, and finance is a very low ranking within the MOD hierarchy at the moment, and they don't have the senior finance people. They don't have anything really equivalent to a chief financial officer who would impose that sort of discipline. Then the other problem is rapid turnover of staff. People stay on project jobs 2 years. They're now trying to increase this to 4 years, but it completely disrupts somebody's promotion. So if you've got a really good rising military staff, the last thing they want to do is spend 4 years in Abbey Woods, missing out on all the wars and the activities and everything which is going on. So that's not going to be attractive in that sort of way. Recognise uncertainty and keep larger reserves. One of the budgeting distinctions is between the main budget and operational expenses for the wars, which come out of the Treasury Special Reserve. So there's battles between those sorts of structures. But you need to have reserves within the main defence budget. But there's no incentives to do that. Now, quite a lot of the problems is the politicians. I'm emphasising the Ministry of Defence, but the politicians have incentives. And a real problem in the last couple of years of the Labour government is they didn't want any bad news coming out of the Ministry of Defence, particularly not bad news which would impact certain Scottish constituencies close to those of Gordon Brown. And so they just stopped cancelling projects during that period. Now, in principle, ministers have the right to make this decision, but the top civil servant, as the accounting officer, can ask for accounting officer instruction. Yes, Minister, you're entitled to waste all this money, but I need it in writing to waste this money. Now that's kind of a nuclear option for civil servants. It's done occasionally, but not very, very often. They'd have to be willing to do that a lot more. And then you'd need to be honest. If the Argentinians were to take over the Falklands again, there is nothing we could do about it. So one may as well admit that. It's not clear if we can afford Trident, particularly since we don't know how long Trident is going to be available to us from the Americans on those terms. So there's a range of problems. So my best guess, I always say economists shouldn't forecast, but my forecast would be more of the same. The cost growth, difficult to estimate, 6 to 8% in real terms. Defence budgets are not going to grow anything like that. They're going to be flat in real terms, maybe 1%. Then for a while you can go on pushing it into the bow wave, as we've always done in the past. Then at some stage this growing imbalance between resources, capabilities and commitments, another defence review. And they're actually scheduling them in now every 5 years. And so I think there's plenty of work for dismal economists, and I can recycle these lectures for a while because I think it's going to be continuing. And to conclude, let me advertise my book. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Ron. We have scheduled some question time. I'm sure there's nothing controversial that was said in the last half hour. So we have a roving microphone, and please, questions.
Yeah, so public sector procurement of this sort, where there's a large amount of uncertainty, there's a lot of technological issues involved, and where there are a range of different clients who have different views. These sort of projects are a disaster everywhere, not just in the public sector. They're just inherently very, very difficult ones. So you certainly get private sector problems in that sort of way. In many cases, the way that you can solve it is by giving somebody ownership of the whole thing and doing the integration. That's quite difficult to do in a very bureaucratic structure. So I think they're not confined to defence. Defence is a lot of them because of the nature of it, but inherently these sort of large, technologically risky procurements where there are a range of different views are just very, very difficult to do in practice. But it would help to be realistic up front about difficulties involved. Okay. The decision was made to scrap the Harriers and scrap the aircraft carriers which they flew from, and the Harriers, which have been recently upgraded, were then sold to the US because they're used by the US Marine Corps, and the US are using them essentially for spare parts for their own Harriers, and they're taking them to part. Ministry of Defence tried to keep this quiet. They didn't like to have a lot of publicity on it. What was decided at the same time was that the plan had been for the new aircraft carriers, which were Queen Elizabeth is the first in the class, would have what was the successor to the Harrier, which was the F-35C variant, short takeoff landing, which would play the same sort of role as the Harrier does on the small aircraft carriers that we have at the moment. They then switched to the F-35B variant, which is what's being used from the US aircraft carriers. This would then involve fitting what are called cats and traps, catapults and an arrestor gear. And again, this is this certainty bias. They had a number for what this would cost, and it ended up the number was completely wrong and there was no allowance for it. There's another problem that there's a problem in the F-35B in that when it lands and this hook comes down and catches, it doesn't come down in the right place. They put it too close together, and it's not at all clear that it'll work. These things are normal in terms of the development, but they're very, very long-term, complicated decision-making, you need to have some. Ministers can't say, well, this is kind of difficult. Toss up, really. We went that way. Could be wrong. You just can't imagine ministers saying that. But that's essentially the position you're in. No, health and education are just much easier than defence in that sort of respect. So in health, they're controversial, but the quality adjusted life years are quite widely used. Education, how many people get degrees, what they know, you can measure that. But defence is much more like an insurance policy. You don't actually know, but it'd be useful to have the military to be able to respond to it. So ideally, and if deterrence works, the military shouldn't do anything at all, but they should just deter anybody from attacking you, and that's fine. Now, the difficulty, to a certain extent, is the insurance policy, which the government is willing to pay for, is sort of third-party fire and theft. But they keep claiming on it as if it's a comprehensive policy and sending the troops off to Iraq and Afghanistan, etc. And the can-do attitude of the troops means that they do that. But valuing defence is just inherently much harder, I think, I think it's the latter. In peacetime, they've got more time to think about the issues. And if you look at the urgent operational requirements, the things which they need now because they're needed in the theatre in Afghanistan or Iraq, they're done very, very quickly. So they can go through very rapidly in terms of doing that. The difficulty about that, and they'll complain about it, is you have to use available technology. You can't do R&D and get something that's different. All you care about is time and meeting a minimum performance goals. So cost, you have to live with it. And then they have what are called defence lines of development. The whole system should fit together. So there should be training, logistic support, a whole range of other things. And you just lose all those things because if you you get the quickest thing you can, put it into service, it's not compatible with all the rest of the systems. So your 7-year cycle or more is to try and get all of these things to fit together. And the real problem with that is that the things which go into the military equipment, particularly the electronics, don't operate on a 7 to 10 year cycle. They operate on the 18-month cycle, driven by Moore's law, as everything goes down. So by the time the electronics is actually in service, not only is it obsolete, it's not even being produced anymore most of the time. And the US Department of Defense has actually set up a special fabrication plant where it buys licenses for the old chips because lots of this equipment, the space shuttle was very old and that sort of way. So the British have not been able to handle radio communication for their armed forces for a long time. And there was a system called Bowman, which is just coming in, and in the Falklands during the 1990s, people were using their mobile phones, their civilian mobile phones, because the military equipment was just so heavy. Anyway, Bowman came in, and essentially the design was 2001, and it went into service 2008 to 2009. Just imagine the changes in mobile telephony and that sort of problem. So it's a real difficulty, and it's just because it becomes so complicated getting the integration in it. But in conflict, they'll very often jury-rig something which works remarkably well, just to do that. And the one last story before I go. In the first Gulf War, 1991, it's fought in deserts, and navigation is a real problem in deserts. You needed GPS, but they hadn't equipped any of these vehicles with GPS. Fortunately, there was a civilian GPS sector. They bought very, very rapidly from the civilian sector, stuck it onto the military vehicles, and could use it. The Americans couldn't do that because they had the Buy America Act. And all these civilian GPS sets were made in Japan. The Japanese gave the Pentagon all these sets as part of their contribution to the war. But having that link into a civilian industry is really, and they can do it fast in operations. It's not clear that even if you scrap the RAF and merge it in, and so the Canadians have a single system, but basically the same conflicts are there during the time. And they're moving to trying to get more, in the military is called purple, joint. It's not khaki, light blue or dark blue. And they try and get, but basically people are attached to their own services, and the cultures are quite different in the three services. And there's a certain amount of issues of morale, motivation, which is useful in that sort of way. Now, so I don't think scrapping the RAF would be a big problem, but it does cause difficulties. So for instance, on helicopters, where the army is using the helicopters, and it uses them in a quite different way from the RAF. And there are these they're usually described as tribal. In the Air Force, only officers can fly things. In the Army, sergeants can fly things as well. And there's these differences which cause some problems. And so it's been a problem with helicopter provision, the views of who's responsible. And they've tried to integrate it, but it still remains. So that inter-service rivalry is a big issue. There's something to be said. So, and some of the procedures are almost like, so if you want a fancy name is spiral development, just buy the basic piece of kit and then just develop it through time as it goes through. And that because you need the equipment for training purposes, getting the experience, etc. But having potentially a larger reserve. So I think the real difficulty is this conspiracy of optimism, the optimism bias, is you're really stuck for those crucial bits of equipment unless there's a UOR for doing that. But I think, again, maybe I'm interested in your views is, would you have gone into procurement executive if they told you you were going to be there 4 years instead of 2 years?
No, absolutely not. Very long time.
And that's a real issue, I think, for a lot of the military. And so the 2-year posting causes some difficulties. They're now trying to make it required that it's a 4 year. But then you can lose contact with the military customers in those. Yep, that's having a fallback civilian system, I think, is there. The nuclear submarines are a real problem because we're just not big enough to afford them. So there were the Vanguard boats which have Trident on them. Then there was a gap to Trafalgar nuclear submarines, which are the attack submarines. During that gap, a whole range of the skills were lost. So Trafalgar then went massively. Trident boats have been built pretty much to budget because they were following a line. Trafalgar went massively over budget and incurred British Aerospace, which bought the yards, ran into big problems because of that. Now we have the same sort of issue again. Can we afford to keep that nuclear submarine industry in business? Now, in principle, we could collaborate with the French, but I think that's an area where it's very unlikely. But so that just keeping that capability to build nuclear submarines is driving a lot of the decisions at the moment. And again, the question is, why do we have a nuclear deterrent? Why is it so important to us? Now, if you could have multilateral disarmament, essentially, my belief is we have a nuclear deterrent because the French have. And if the French and British could agree to disarm, that might be a way to do it.
Thank you, Anna.
Everyone has the problems, but the US has more money to throw at it, so that it's less apparent in terms of capability losses. There's also issues, so for instance, one of the problems with our UORs for the armoured vehicles in Afghanistan was that the US was the main supplier and it also wanted them. So we couldn't get ours until the US demand had been met properly. China's military power is growing. It's because it spends a roughly constant share of GDP. It's difficult to know exactly how much, probably around 3%, something like that, 3.5%. But if your GDP is growing at 10% a year, that is a lot more military capability every year. So just automatically, by keeping a constant share and growing very, very rapidly, and how China will develop in terms of its strategic relations, I think is very, very uncertain. And to a certain extent, they're running into a number of the difficulties of being a hegemonic power, because they're being seen in parts of Africa as being neo-colonial, and so that there's a set of issues of how they're developing that sort of way. But I don't see the US is, I don't think it is going to be threatened. It's still so big relative to everybody else in that way.
Well, thank you very much. Before we thank Ron for a second time, this was of course the inaugural Ronald Tress Memorial Lecture. There will be another next year. I don't know if Ron will have finished sorting out all these problems by then. One would hope so, but probably the topic will be a different one. But I would like to thank Ron and all our distinguished guests and our audience. And we do have a reception out in the foyer, so please do make your way there. So thank you.